John Harper had always been a man who took immense pride in his home, especially his backyard. It wasn't just any ordinary backyard. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of everyday life and find peace. Nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, John's property stood out like a little slice of paradise. The grass was perfectly trimmed, vibrant flowers bloomed in neat rows along the fence, and there was even a small vegetable garden tucked away in one corner. But the crown jewel of it all was the swimming pool. The pool itself was stunning, a sparkling rectangle of crystal clear water that reflected the sunlight during the day and shimmered under the soft glow of string lights at night. John had saved up for years to install it, meticulously planning every detail from its size to the surrounding deck made of rich, polished wood. He imagined lazy afternoons lounging by the water or hosting intimate gatherings with close friends. For him, the pool represented more than just luxury. It symbolized hard work paying off. At first, everything went according to plan. John spent countless weekends enjoying his creation, reading books while floating on an inflatable raft, or simply soaking in the tranquility of his surroundings. But then something unexpected happened. Slowly but surely, his neighbors began showing up uninvited. At first, it seemed harmless enough. A couple of kids sneaking through the side gate to cool off on hot summer days. They'd splash around for a bit before running back home, leaving behind wet footprints and maybe a forgotten towel. John didn't mind too much. Kids will be kids, after all. But as time went on, the situation escalated. More and more people started treating his pool like their own personal playground. Teenagers would jump over the fence late at night, blasting loud music and throwing impromptu parties. Families would bring coolers full of drinks and snacks, leaving empty cans and wrappers scattered across his patio. Strangers he didn't even recognize started appearing, as though word had gotten out that John's backyard was now some kind of public resort. It wasn't just the mess that bothered him, though that was bad enough. Empty chip bags crunched underfoot, soda bottles rolled into corners, and muddy footprints marred his once pristine deck. What really got to John was the lack of respect. His private space, which he had poured so much effort and money into creating, was being treated like a free-for-all. People acted as if they owned the place, coming and going whenever they pleased without so much as a thank you or even asking permission. John tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself that maybe this was just how neighborhoods worked. Maybe everyone assumed his pool was fair game because it looked inviting. But deep down, resentment simmered. Every time he heard laughter echoing from his backyard when he wasn't home, every time he found trash littering the area, it felt like a punch to the gut. This was his space, not theirs. And yet, no matter what he did, the intrusions continued. As weeks turned into months, John grew increasingly frustrated. He loved his backyard, but it no longer brought him joy. Instead, it became a constant reminder of how powerless he felt to protect his own property. Something had to give, but what? How could he reclaim his sanctuary without causing a rift with his neighbors? Little did he know, the solution brewing in his mind would soon lead to a series of events that would change everything. For better or worse, John knew he couldn't let things continue the way they were. His once peaceful backyard had turned into a chaotic free-for-all, and it was wearing him down. He decided to take action, but not in an aggressive or confrontational way. After all, these were his neighbors, people he saw every day at the grocery store or passed on evening walks. He wanted to handle the situation diplomatically, hoping that a polite approach would solve the problem without causing unnecessary tension. His first step was simple: communication. John spent an afternoon crafting handwritten notes, each one carefully worded to avoid sounding accusatory. "Dear neighbors," the notes began, "I hope this message finds you well. I just wanted to kindly remind everyone that the pool in my backyard is private property. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'd really appreciate it if you could refrain from using it without permission. Thank you so much for understanding." He signed each note with his name and left them on the doors of houses where he suspected the frequent visitors lived. For a few days, things seemed to improve. The gate to his backyard stayed closed, and the pool remained undisturbed. John allowed himself a small sigh of relief, thinking maybe his polite reminder had done the trick. But his optimism didn't last long. By the end of the week, the trespassers were back, with a vengeance. This time, they weren't just kids sneaking in for a quick dip. Adults joined in, bringing coolers filled with drinks and snacks. Music blared late into the night, and John woke up to find empty soda cans and crumpled napkins scattered across his deck. Frustrated but still determined to keep things civil, John decided to try again. This time, he organized a neighborhood gathering, a casual barbecue where everyone could come together and enjoy some food. He figured it was the perfect opportunity to address the issue face to face in a friendly setting. On the day of the event, John fired up the grill, set out plates of burgers and hot dogs, and welcomed his neighbors with a warm smile. As they mingled and laughed, he took a deep breath and stood up to speak. "Thank you all for coming today," he started, his tone light and conversational. "I love living here in this neighborhood. It's such a great community. But there's something I need to bring up because it's been bothering me lately." He paused, looking around at the faces staring back at him. Some looked curious, others slightly uneasy. "My pool has become, well, let's just say it's getting a lot more use than I expected. And while I understand that it might look tempting, it's important to remember that it's private property. I'd really appreciate it if we could all respect that moving forward." The crowd nodded politely, murmuring agreements. A few people even apologized, saying they hadn't realized how much their actions were affecting him. John felt hopeful as the evening wound down. Maybe now, finally, things would settle down. For a brief moment, he believed his patience and kindness had paid off. But reality quickly proved otherwise. Within days, the gate was propped open again, and strangers he didn't recognize were lounging by the pool like they owned the place. Trash piled up, towels were left draped over his patio chairs, and the noise level skyrocketed. It was clear that his attempts to reason with his neighbors hadn't worked. If anything, the situation seemed worse than before. John sat by the pool one evening, staring at the water that reflected the fading sunlight. He felt defeated, like no amount of politeness or reasoning could change the behavior of those around him. He had tried being understanding, tried explaining his feelings, and yet nothing had changed. The constant intrusions were taking a toll, not just on his backyard, but on his peace of mind. Something inside him snapped. Enough was enough. He needed a new plan, one that would send a stronger message. As he sat there lost in thought, an idea began to form. One that was bold, unconventional, and perhaps a little mischievous. Whatever it took, John was ready to reclaim his space. John sat by the pool that evening, his mind racing with frustration and exhaustion. He had tried everything he could think of. Polite notes, friendly conversations, even a neighborhood barbecue. But nothing seemed to work. His neighbors continued to treat his backyard like their own personal playground, completely disregarding his requests for privacy. The situation felt hopeless, as though no matter what he did, they would never respect his boundaries. But instead of giving in to despair, John's thoughts took a sharp turn toward creativity. As he stared at the shimmering water reflecting the fading light, an idea began to take shape in his mind. One so unexpected, so audacious, that it made him chuckle out loud. What if, instead of fighting against the intrusions, he embraced them? Not in the way they expected, of course, but in a way that would leave them stunned and reconsidering their actions. A slow grin spread across his face as the pieces of his plan fell into place. It was risky, yes, but also brilliant. And most importantly, it just might work. The next morning, John sprang into action. He started by heading to the local hardware store, where he picked up rolls of bright orange caution tape. "What's this for?" the cashier asked casually as she rang up his purchase. John simply smiled and replied, "Oh, a little project around the house." If only she knew the mischief brewing in his mind. Back home, he got to work, stringing the caution tape along the fence surrounding the pool area. He added large, bold signs that read, "Warning, pool under maintenance. Do not enter," in capital letters. The effect was immediate and convincing. Anyone looking at the scene would assume something serious was going on. But John wasn't done yet. To sell the illusion, he bought a lifeguard chair from a second-hand shop and placed it near the deep end of the pool. He scattered empty bottles labeled chemical treatment around the deck, making it look like hazardous substances were being used. Then came the pièce de résistance, transforming the pristine blue water into something far less inviting. Using food coloring and non-toxic algae powder, he wasn't about to harm anyone after all. John dyed the pool water a murky green. From a distance, it looked like a swamp, a toxic, off-putting mess that no one in their right mind would want to swim in. As he stepped back to admire his handiwork, John couldn't help but laugh. The once beautiful pool now resembled something out of a horror movie. The lifeguard chair loomed ominously, the caution tape fluttered in the breeze, and the green water gave off an eerie vibe. It was perfect. Anyone who dared to trespass now would be met with a sight so unappealing that they'd think twice about ever coming back. Still, John knew this plan carried risks. What if someone figured out it was all a ruse? What if the neighbors accused him of being unreasonable or childish? Doubts crept into his mind, but he pushed them aside. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming his space. He had given them plenty of chances to respect his property, and they had ignored every single one. Now it was time to show them that crossing boundaries had consequences. That night, as he locked up the house and turned off the lights, John allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Tomorrow would be the true test of his plan. Would the neighbors fall for it? Would they finally get the message? As he climbed into bed, he couldn't stop thinking about how things might play out. One thing was certain: whatever happened next, it was bound to be interesting. For better or worse, John Harper was ready to take back control of his backyard and teach his neighbors a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The next morning, John woke up early, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. He peeked out the window to check on his backyard setup one last time before heading downstairs. The pool looked exactly as he had left it. Murky green water shimmering eerily under the pale morning light, caution tape crisscrossing the fence like a warning from a disaster movie, and the lifeguard chair standing tall as if guarding some forbidden zone. It was perfect. Now all he had to do was wait. He poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into a chair by the kitchen window, where he could keep an eye on the backyard without being seen. His neighbors weren't usually early risers, so he figured it would take a little while for anyone to notice the changes. But patience wasn't exactly John's strong suit, not when he'd spent so much time planning this elaborate ruse. Every creak of a gate or distant footsteps made him sit up straighter, wondering if today would finally be the day his plan came to life. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, a group of teenagers strolled casually toward his yard, their laughter carrying over the fence. They were regular offenders, always sneaking in when they thought no one was watching. Today, however, they froze the moment they saw what awaited them. One boy stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the green water. Another nudged him and whispered something, pointing at the caution tape and signs. A third grabbed a stick lying nearby and poked cautiously at the surface of the pool, wrinkling his nose at the faint odor wafting up, the result of John's clever use of fish tank additives to mimic the smell of chemicals. "This is disgusting," one of them muttered loud enough for John to hear through the window. "What even happened here?" "I don't know, man, but I'm not touching that," another replied, backing away slowly. "Looks toxic." John suppressed a laugh, biting his lip to keep quiet. Watching their reactions was almost too satisfying. These were the same kids who had thrown raucous parties in his backyard just weeks earlier, leaving behind trash and chaos. Now, faced with his carefully crafted illusion, they couldn't get away fast enough. Within minutes, they were gone, muttering about how gross everything looked and vowing never to come back. But the real test came later that afternoon. Adults from the neighborhood started showing up, poking their heads over the fence or pausing curiously near the gate. Some squinted at the lifeguard chair and the scattered bottles labeled chemical treatment, shaking their heads in disapproval. Others snapped photos, likely planning to share the mess with their friends. Word spread quickly. John Harper's pool wasn't just off limits, it was ruined. By evening, the gossip had reached every corner of the neighborhood. Parents exchanged concerned glances during walks, whispering about how unfortunate it was that such a beautiful pool had turned into a swamp. Kids avoided the area entirely, steering clear of the ominous caution tape. Even strangers who had once wandered in uninvited seemed to vanish overnight. For the first time in months, John's backyard felt truly peaceful and completely his own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, John stepped outside to survey his handiwork. The air was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. No music blared in the distance, no voices echoed around the pool. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of guilt. Had he gone too far? Was tricking his neighbors really the right thing to do? But then he reminded himself of everything he'd endured, the endless cleanups, the sleepless nights, the feeling of powerlessness as people treated his property like theirs. This wasn't malice. It was self-preservation. And besides, maybe this outrageous stunt would teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. As John locked the gate behind him and headed back inside, he allowed himself a small smile. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. His backyard was finally free of unwanted guests. Days passed, and John's backyard remained blissfully quiet. The once bustling pool area was now a ghost town, with no signs of intruders daring to cross the threshold. It was exactly what John had hoped for: peace, solitude, and a sense of control over his own property. But as the initial satisfaction wore off, an unexpected emotion began to creep in: guilt. At first, it was just a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He told himself he had every right to protect his space, especially after months of frustration and countless attempts to reason with his neighbors. Still, the image of their shocked faces lingered in his thoughts. The teenagers poking at the water with sticks, the adults shaking their heads in disappointment, the whispered conversations about how John's pool is ruined now. It all weighed on him more than he cared to admit. One evening, as he sat by the kitchen window sipping tea, John found himself replaying moments from the past few weeks. He remembered the apologies some neighbors had offered during the barbecue, the way others had seemed genuinely unaware of how much their actions bothered him. Maybe they weren't all bad people. Maybe many of them simply hadn't realized the impact of their behavior. And yet, here he was, deceiving them with a prank that bordered on cruel. Was this really who he wanted to be? A man who tricked his neighbors into thinking his prized possession was destroyed. The turning point came when Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, knocked on his door. She was one of the few neighbors John actually liked, a kind, soft-spoken woman who always greeted him warmly during walks. Today, however, her expression was serious. "John," she began hesitantly, "I heard about your pool. I'm so sorry it got ruined. If there's anything we can do to help, well, you know where to find us." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Here was someone who genuinely cared, someone willing to lend a hand without expecting anything in return. Yet instead of accepting her kindness, John felt a lump rise in his throat. How could he look her in the eye knowing he lied to her and everyone else? That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, replaying Mrs. Peterson's visit in his mind. By morning, he knew what he had to do. It wasn't going to be easy. Admitting the truth meant risking embarrassment and possibly angering the very people he hoped to reconcile with. But deep down, John knew it was the right thing to do. The next day, he called another neighborhood gathering. Not a casual barbecue this time, but a proper meeting. Chairs were set up in his driveway, and slowly the neighbors trickled in, curious about why John had summoned them. Some looked wary, others amused, but all were attentive as John stepped forward to speak. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "There's something I need to say, and I think you deserve to hear it." He took a deep breath before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I did something, well, let's just call it unconventional. You've probably noticed my pool looks pretty terrible right now. Green water, caution tape, the whole 9 yards. What you don't know is that it's not real. None of it is." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people exchanged confused glances. John pressed on. "I dyed the water green, bought fake chemical bottles, and put up the caution tape myself. I thought if I made the pool look unusable, you'd finally stop coming over uninvited. And honestly, it worked. For the first time in months, I had peace." He paused, letting his confession sink in. Some neighbors looked shocked, others amused, but most seemed to understand. "But here's the thing," John continued, his tone softer now. "In trying to solve one problem, I created another. I hurt people's feelings, including some of yours. And for that, I'm truly sorry." Silence fell over the group as they absorbed his words. Then, unexpectedly, someone started clapping. It was Mr. Dawson, a gruff but good-hearted man who often joked about borrowing John's pool. Others joined in, until the entire crowd erupted into applause. John blinked in surprise, unsure whether they were mocking him or genuinely appreciating his honesty. Mrs. Peterson stood up, smiling warmly. "John," she said, "we're not proud of what we did either. We should have respected your space a long time ago. But thank you for telling us the truth. That takes guts." Relief washed over John as he realized his gamble had paid off. Instead of resentment, his neighbors responded with understanding and even gratitude. For the first time in months, he felt like part of a community rather than an outsider fighting against it. As the meeting ended and people began chatting among themselves, John couldn't help but smile. The battle was over, but the war, that had just turned into something far better. John's heartfelt confession at the neighborhood meeting sparked something unexpected, a wave of empathy and cooperation that swept through the community. What started as an apology turned into a turning point, not just for John but for everyone involved. The neighbors, inspired by his honesty and vulnerability, decided it was time to make amends, not just with words, but with actions. The very next morning, John woke up to find a small group of neighbors already gathered in his backyard. At first, he panicked, thinking they were there to confront him or demand explanations. But as he stepped outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he realized they weren't empty-handed. Buckets, scrub brushes, and cleaning supplies were piled near the pool, and several people were already hard at work. Mrs. Peterson was on her knees scrubbing algae powder off the deck tiles, while Mr. Dawson hauled away trash bags filled with debris. Even the teenagers who had once partied by the pool were pitching in, dragging hoses to rinse down the patio furniture. What's going on?" John asked, scratching his head in disbelief. "We're fixing this," said Sarah, a young mother who lived across the street. She gestured toward the pool with a grin. "You went to all that trouble to teach us a lesson, so now we're returning the favor. Consider it our way of saying sorry." John was speechless. He watched as the chaotic mess he created began transforming back into the beautiful oasis he remembered. Someone had brought a pressure washer, which made quick work of the grimy residue left behind by the fake chemicals. Others worked together to drain the green water and refill the pool with fresh, crystal-clear liquid. By lunchtime, the backyard looked almost exactly as it had before John's prank, except this time, it felt different. It wasn't just his space anymore. It belonged to everyone who cared enough to help restore it. As the day wore on, more neighbors arrived, bringing food and drinks to keep everyone energized. Someone fired up a portable grill, filling the air with the smell of burgers and hot dogs. Laughter echoed around the yard, mingling with the sound of splashing water, as kids dipped their toes into the newly cleaned pool. For the first time in months, John didn't feel anxious or frustrated. Instead, he felt grateful and connected. These were his neighbors, flaws and all, and they had come together to right their wrongs. By evening, the transformation was complete. The pool sparkled under the setting sun, its surface smooth and inviting. The lifeguard chair and caution tape were gone, replaced by neatly arranged lounge chairs and colorful umbrellas. Someone even hung string lights above the deck, casting a warm glow over the entire area. It was better than John could have imagined. But the surprises didn't end there. As the crowd gathered around the pool for one last celebration, Mr. Dawson stepped forward holding a large wooden plaque. On it were engraved words that made John's heart swell. Community Pool, shared with love. Beneath the title was a list of names, each neighbor signing their commitment to respect the space and use it responsibly. "This is for you, John," Mr. Dawson said, handing him the plaque. "We know it's still your pool, but we want to show that we're serious about making things right. From now on, we'll only use it when you say it's okay. And if anyone breaks the rules, well, let's just say they'll answer to all of us." John accepted the plaque with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the gesture. He hadn't expected forgiveness, let alone this level of support. In that moment, he realized something important. Boundaries didn't have to mean walls. They could be bridges, if both sides were willing to meet halfway. As the night drew to a close and the neighbors began heading home, John stood by the pool, staring at the plaque. His backyard was no longer a battleground. It was a symbol of unity, a reminder that even the toughest conflicts could lead to meaningful connections. And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. In the weeks that followed, John's backyard became a hub of activity. But this time, it was different. The chaos and disrespect were gone, replaced by a sense of order and shared responsibility. The neighbors had taken their promise seriously, working together to create a schedule for using the pool. Everyone signed up for specific days and times, ensuring there was no overcrowding or conflict. It wasn't just about swimming anymore. It was about building a stronger community. John watched as the transformation unfolded before his eyes. On weekends, families gathered around the pool, laughing and chatting while children splashed in the shallow end. Teenagers, once the culprits of late-night parties, now helped keep the area clean, taking turns sweeping the deck or emptying trash bins. Even Mrs. Peterson, who rarely ventured outdoors, started joining the gatherings, settling into a lounge chair with a book and a glass of lemonade. Her presence brought warmth to the group, reminding everyone of the importance of connection across generations. To make things official, the neighbors held another meeting to establish guidelines for the community pool, as they affectionately called it. They agreed on simple rules. No loud music after sunset, no uninvolved guests without prior approval, and absolutely no trash left behind. To ensure fairness, they rotated responsibilities, assigning each household a week to oversee maintenance. John, though still technically the owner, stepped back from micromanaging. He trusted his neighbors to uphold their promises, and they didn't disappoint. One particularly memorable Saturday, the neighborhood organized its first ever pool day extravaganza. Tables were set up with homemade dishes, from Mrs. Peterson's famous peach cobbler to Mr. Dawson's barbecue ribs. Kids raced each other in floating tubes, while adults challenged one another to friendly games of water volleyball. Someone even brought a Bluetooth speaker, playing soft music that added to the festive atmosphere without crossing the volume limit. For the first time, John felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a real community united by shared values and mutual respect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the water, John stood at the edge of the pool, watching the scene unfold. He couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. What had once been a source of frustration and division was now a symbol of unity and joy. His prank, though extreme, had forced everyone to confront their actions and work toward a solution. And in doing so, They had built something truly special. That evening, as the last of the guests trickled out, Sarah approached John with a warm smile. "You know," she said, "this place feels magical now. Not because of the pool itself, but because of what it represents." John nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The pool wasn't just a place to cool off during summer. It was a reminder that people could grow and change when given the chance. It was proof that honesty, humility, and compromise could turn enemies into allies. And most importantly, it was evidence that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of positivity. The next morning, John woke up early to enjoy some quiet time by the pool. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed something new: tiny footprints leading from the gate to the water's edge. At first, he tensed, worried that someone had broken the rules. But then he saw a note taped to the fence. Written in careful handwriting were the words, "Thank you for sharing your space with us. We'll always remember to respect it." John smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was missing. His backyard wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had worked to restore it. And in giving a piece of himself to his neighbors, he had gained something far greater: trust, friendship, and a renewed sense of belonging. For the first time in years, John Harper felt completely at home, not just in his house, but in his heart. Months had passed since John Harper's backyard became the heart of his neighborhood, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and fulfilling. The pool, once a source of stress and conflict, was now a cherished gathering spot where laughter echoed and friendships deepened. On any given weekend, you could find children building sandcastles in inflatable buckets, parents chatting over cold drinks, and even the occasional game of Marco Polo breaking out among the teens. The transformation was remarkable, not just of the space itself, but of the people who shared it. John often found himself sitting by the pool in the evenings, watching as the sunlight danced across the water. It amazed him how much things had changed. Once a man who dreaded the thought of neighbors encroaching on his property, he now looked forward to their visits. They weren't intruders anymore. They were friends. Friends who respected boundaries, cleaned up after themselves, and genuinely appreciated what he had created. What surprised him most, though, was how much he had grown through the process. He learned that standing up for yourself didn't have to mean shutting others out, and that compromise didn't mean losing control. One evening, as he lounged in a chair with a book, Sarah approached him with her young son, Liam, trailing behind her. "Hey, John," she said, smiling warmly. "Liam wanted to say thank you." The little boy stepped forward shyly, holding out a drawing. It was a colorful picture of the pool surrounded by stick figures, all smiling and holding hands. In big wobbly letters at the top, it read, "Best pool ever." John chuckled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Liam," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "This is going straight to my fridge." Moments like these reminded John why he had fought so hard to reclaim his backyard, not just for himself, but for moments like this one. The pool wasn't just a place to swim. It was a bridge between people, a reminder that shared spaces could bring out the best in everyone when treated with care. Still, John occasionally thought about the lessons he learned along the way. He realized that his initial frustration hadn't been entirely misplaced. People had taken advantage of his generosity, assuming that because something looked inviting, it must be free for the taking. But instead of addressing the issue openly, he had let resentment build until it boiled over. His prank, while effective, had taught him an important lesson. Sometimes, solving problems required more than clever tricks. It required honesty and vulnerability. His neighbors, too, had grown from the experience. They had gone from careless trespassers to responsible stewards of a shared resource. Many admitted privately that they hadn't realized how their actions affected John, or each other, until his bold move forced them to confront their behavior. Now they took pride in maintaining the pool and ensuring it remained a welcoming space for everyone. As summer turned to fall, the pool parties became less frequent, but the bond between neighbors remained strong. Holiday gatherings replaced barbecues, and cozy porch chats took the place of sunny afternoons by the water. John found himself looking forward to winter, not because he disliked hosting, but because it gave him time to reflect on everything they had built together. On a crisp autumn morning, John stood by the pool one last time before covering it for the season. The leaves swirled gently in the breeze, and the surface of the water reflected the golden light of the changing trees. He thought about how far they had come, from chaos to cooperation, from division to unity. The pool was no longer just his prized possession. It was a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of community. As he locked the gate behind him, John smiled to himself. Life wasn't perfect, and neither were his neighbors, but that was okay. Perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was, and in reclaiming his backyard, John had discovered something far more valuable than peace and quiet, a sense of belonging. He walked back inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that if they worked together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. After all, a good neighbor isn't someone who never makes mistakes. It's someone willing to fix them. And in that regard, John Harper and his entire neighborhood had become the very best kind of neighbors.